The Cirrus G7. Today is a follow-up video on checking out the airplane, flying it for the first time, and giving you a proper breakdown on some of the features that we talked about that this airplane comes with. If you're new to the channel or new to aviation in general, please just take a seat, put the seatbelt on. My name is Mike. I am a pilot, instrument rated pilot, and I am obsessed with airplanes. And recently, earlier this year, Cirrus, one of the best known brands in civil aviation, they came out with their Generation 7 for the SR20 and the SR22 series. And we covered that initially, but this week I actually got a chance to spend some up close personal time with the aircraft itself. And I have some reporting to do. I have to say that when it comes to Cirrus, it's a love and hate relationship within the pilot community and just the public in general. One, this is one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, single engine piston planes you can buy, right? And they're considered cream of the crop when it comes to luxury, comfort, whatever label you want to put on it. So you have this love and hate relationship with the models in the pilot community. But I do think, like anything else, it's very important to actually experience either flying or being around these products before you can say anything. Because I started off also kind of looking at Cirrus like that plane over there, partly because I couldn't afford it, right? But after checking out a bunch of Cirrus over the years, I think this week actually was the very first time that I got to fly one, like actually fly one. I've flown in other Cirruses, but I've never really flown one. And so that's why I wanted to make this video, but more particularly to the G7. As you know, with the G7, Cirrus came up with so many new features with this airplane. The airframe is still the same. The sit-in configuration, for the most part, is still the same. You still have your sight sticks. What's mostly significant and different with the G7 models, I believe I think the gross weight of the SR20 changed. It increased a bit in the Generation 7, or probably from the previous generation. So now you have over 3,000 pounds of gross weight for this airplane, which really is the first thing that I personally noticed. So guys, my history in flying airplanes, and I've been in several different models over the years, but in terms of airplanes that I've built my own hours in, they're generally smaller and lighter planes. As you know, I flew the Sling TSI for 2-3 years. That's a plane that's gross weight 2,100 pounds. In other hours, I have light sports or just lighter airplanes, even your conventional Cherokees and Cessna's 172, you still have a lower gross weight. And the plane that I trained in, that I built my first 150 hours in, was a Diamond DA40. And I remember that plane, I think, is gross around 2.5 or around 2,600 pounds. So I say all of that to say that when I flew the Generation 7 SR20, right, that was the first thing that I noticed, was how heavy it was, or how heavier it was than the other planes or other single engine airplanes that I had flown over the years. And depending on who you are or your preference, I think when you get in the airplane, you touch that handle, especially on takeoff. That's the first time I really noticed it, right? On takeoff, I can see like, oh wow, this thing is heavy, but heavy in a good way. Okay, so let me describe. Now, this video will either release before or after the actual flight video comes out, which I plan to drop sometime soon. So the first thing I noticed when I jumped into the left seat and we closed the doors was how insulated I feel, right? So I'm used to flying, again, very thin shell, thin insulated airplanes. But in the Cirrus, it felt, one, the cabin is much bigger, and it just felt insulated, right? I could barely hear noises from outside. It felt like I was in a proper vehicle. And then on taxiing, on takeoff, you can feel the heaviness both on the stick and just the plane, and then climbing and turning. Guys, I'm telling you, I'm used to finger flying because I fly light sports, I fly light airplanes. So usually the airplanes that I fly, you just kind of nudge it with your finger and boom, it's like flying a sports car. Whereas with the Cirrus, the best way to describe it, honestly, it's like going from a Chevy Spark to say a BMW X5, or going from a Chevy Spark to a Mercedes SL500, which was an experience I had where for a while I was driving this tiny little car. Actually, no, I was driving a Fiat. I was driving a Fiat 500, and then I bought a SL500 at some point. And if you ever driven an SL500, the nose of that car is very heavy, and you can feel the heaviness, but also the stability of the vehicle. That's how I would describe my experience in taking off and getting into the air with this airplane. It felt heavy, but also it felt more stable. Like the turns, you just kind of ease into them, right? And then that brings me to my next point, which is the bumps. So on the day I flew the SR22 G7, it was pretty warm outside, over 80 degrees. If you've flown around the southeast region, you know, we get cloud pop-ups here and there, and we also have a lot of trees. So thermal action is very real when you're flying in the state of Georgia, for example. So during the summertime or when it's warmer, you get tossed around quite a bit, especially at low altitude. And in taking off, I remember when we're climbing, I was like, why am I not feeling this? And guys, if you've seen my videos in the Sling TSI, you will see how bouncy I am in that airplane. And in flying the G7, I was like, wait, this is all the bumps? And I'm telling you, because again, from a pilot perspective, it really felt like the plane was absorbing all of the bumps that I could barely feel it inside. And I remember that was like ding, ding, ding. So perfect example was, I've taken my girls up in the Sling TSI a few times. And one of the feedbacks that I get each time, particularly from my wife, was, man, it's very bumpy. And in a plane like the TSI or any lighter airplane, you feel that the bumps a lot more than a heavier plane, which was the case here. So I remember on climbing, and again, we had some scatter clouds, thermal was doing its thing. There were some bumps, but you could barely feel it. Now, for those of you who have flown in heavier planes, or you already fly a Cirrus, you might not realize any of this stuff that I'm talking about, but for guys or pilots who are coming from a smaller or lighter airplanes, I encourage you to go take a test flight in a Cirrus and then come back and leave a comment, and you see exactly what I mean. So those are the first two things that was significant to me, was how heavy it was on the hands, how stable it was, and then how it performed, or how I rarely felt any bumps when we were flying. Now let's talk about some of the cool tech and features in the plane, which we've covered most of it, but a few jumped out to me when I flew the airplane. So I mentioned in a previous video that the SR22 G7 is an entry into the jet world, and I got a lot of flack for that. The reason I say that is, when you get into this airplane, one, it's push to start. You have a lot of things now automated, right? It's almost like flying a FADEC engine, although you're not. The SR20 uses a Lycoming 390, so it's a conventional engine, but they've built some cool features around it that it feels like you're flying a jet. So on turning on your avionics in the Cirrus SR20, you have literally, so you have this checklist on your screen. You have a flow that the airplane guides you on, and I'm on doing this, like when we were going through, I was like, wait, am I flying a piston engine airplane or entry-level airplane? It really felt like we were about to take off or fly a jet. And the reason I say that, I remember my very first experience flying in the right seat of a jet was a Citation 550. This was a couple of years ago. And I remember the very first time when my friend Kid, he was going through the checklist, and I was like, oh, this is how it's done in a jet. So generally with a jet, you have a checklist, and then the system just goes through the flow with you. It guides you, and then you do your checklist usually also is on the screen. Same thing happened years later when I flew in the Honda Jet. I looked at how the flow of things went. Same thing when I flew in the Cirrus Jet, and that's the same exact system that Cirrus now puts in this smaller plane, right? If it has a jet flow to it. And by the way, those avionics, I can't see anything else that competes with it, because you literally have the Garmin G3000 in the SR20, and then now you have the Perspective Touch, where it's not touchscreen instead of the keypads. And again, your flow, you go from top to bottom. It takes you through checklists, like little things or basic details. It tells you, hey, have you checked this? Have you checked this? And then you would hit confirm, go to next thing, go to next thing, go to next thing. Only in a jet have I seen that happen. Generally, when I've flown in a single engine plane, I have a paper checklist. I go through it, boom, boom, boom. Engines on, let's go, right? But this takes you through a proper flow of how things work. And that's why I said it's an entry into the jet world, because as a pilot, once you build enough time flying a system like this, when you're ready to get into, say, a turboprop or an actual jet, I promise you, it would be so much more easier with the transition of learning the systems. One interesting feature I didn't mention in my previous review video was the seatbelt. So in the G7, and I don't know if this already existed in previous models of the series, but this was the first time that I saw this. So in your seatbelt, you have airbags in the seatbelt of the aircraft. And I thought that was pretty cool. Like they truly mean safety with this brand. Obviously you have the parachute up top, which is what Cirrus is well known for, but now they also gave you airbags in your seatbelt, which I thought was pretty cool. Another feature we covered previously is the 3D taxi. Now I got some time with this, right? And when I described it in the previous video, I was just kind of talking about it from my perspective, having not checked it out in person. So with the 3D taxi that's been introduced in the G7, you now have really 3D graphics with your taxiway whenever you're at a new airport. And if you're not a pilot, you may not understand or see the significance of this, but when you're a pilot, trust me, and you fly cross country often, when you go to a new airport, you want to be able to know your way around, right? It's actually part of your pre-flight to get to know your destination airport. But once you touch down, it's better to have a map of the airport so you know where you're going. It gives you direction. But with this 3D taxi in the new G7, man, I don't see how you can get anything wrong, because it's so simplified. The graphics are crisp, and I remember when we were taxiing initially, and then when we touched down and I saw this thing in action, I was like, man, this is beautiful. This is what they're really charging you for. So from a pilot perspective, I think that it's such an amazing feature, and I do think it's a very practical feature that will help you out either as a beginner or as an experienced pilot, because this is a tool that you're gonna need and use if you fly often to new destination or a new airport. So the 3D taxi, big check mark on that. It was pretty amazing when I got a chance to use it. And the last feature I'll talk about is the fuel selector. Again, in the previous video, it was one of the things that I noticed and mentioned, but this was the first time that I got to use it. So in the new G7, you now have an automatic fuel selector. Again, you generally get this in jets, okay? I've never seen it in a piston or smaller planes. Generally, when you're flying a single engine airplane, you have to manually time yourself and switch your fuel tanks whenever you're flying a cross-country flight. That's what I'm used to, that's what I've always done. But in the new Cirrus G7, you have a computer doing the switch for you. And guys, it's so easy. So when you get in the airplane, you see your fuel selector down there and it's covered. It has a cover and the cover is closed, which means, and you see it on your screen and it shows, okay, now you're an auto selector, meaning you let the system automatically select the fuel tanks for you. Now, initially when you start your engines or after you start your engines, you do manually change it to whatever tanks you want to taxi or take off. But once you're flying, the system does everything. The way to actuate that is to leave the door of that fuel selector closed. If you do open the door of the fuel selector, then you switch it back to manual mode and you can do the turns yourself. So I thought that was pretty cool. Again, whether you're on the loving side or the hating side, you still have to appreciate some of these features because it does take the workload away from the pilot, especially, you know, if you're flying instrument. When you fly instrument flight plans, you're doing more as a pilot. And when you have the aircraft working with you and reducing your task, that's priceless to me. So when you're signing a big check for a Cirrus SR20 or 22, it's better to understand what you're actually getting for the money. When I flew this airplane, it honestly felt like I didn't have to compromise. And this is coming from someone who is not a Cirrus pilot. As a matter of fact, I've been on the opposite side of the spectrum when it comes to this plane. But for the first time, I actually thought, man, I feel like I didn't have to compromise for anything. Everything I would need in terms of safety feature, in terms of ease of flying the airplane, in terms of comfort, in terms of feeling good to bring a friend or family members along, this airplane has it. And so I think for anyone who is either new to aviation or you're actually in the market for a single engine airplane, I think if you have the bank for it, I would seriously check out a Cirrus. Honestly, I would seriously check it out. This is a plane that I think you can live with for longer periods, and it checks off a lot of boxes. And for those who are considering SR20 or SR22, again, my opinion has changed on this because most pilots generally go for the 22. And for years, I've always wondered why, because the SR20 generally is like that thing over there. It's considered a trainer, but this is a personal plane. It can be used as a cross-country machine for a long time. And for whatever reason, I don't know why pilots just opt in for the SR22. Obviously, you can do more with the 22. You have bigger tanks, you can go longer, you have, you know, a heavier airplane, so you can load up the SR22 more. You also have anti-icing device on the SR22. But here's the thing, if you're not, depending on where you are located, if you're not flying in the north region of the country, you may not need even Ficky or anti-icing device on board. Speed obviously is something to consider. In the SR20, you generally plan for 150 knots. In the SR22, you can go up to 180, 200 knots in that airplane, which is a significant gap in speed that you could think about. But honestly, I think for a newer pilot or even more experienced pilot, if you want to build time and you want to do it in comfort and you want to do it in a capable airplane and you have the bank for it, I would seriously check out the SR20. And it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars less than the SR22. So I don't think that's something you should sneeze at or just be passive about. It's worth looking at. That's all I have to say. So that is my updated review on the G7. I truly enjoyed my time with this airplane, and no longer do I think of Cirrus as just this crazy expensive aircraft. Yes, you're gonna be paying more for it, but it's important to actually experience and check it out to see what you're paying for. And I think I can respect the thought that went into the design of the aircraft, because again, it really feels like you're not compromising with anything, which is usually the case with civilian airplanes, it feels like you have to compromise with one or two things. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. If you are a Cirrus pilot, or if this is a plane that you're considering, or you've had experience with Cirrus, whether flying it or dealing with, maintenance or whatever, I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. Okay, that is my spiel, guys. If you are looking to get your pilot's license, make sure you check out my flight school at lookupflightacademy.com. It can get you your license or get you all the way to your commercial rating if this is a career path that you want to pursue. Again, that's lookupflightacademy.com. Okay, support the channel, like, subscribe, notification bell on. Also, pick up some merch, Alpha Papa, in the description below. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Peace.